The following is paid programming. Welcome to Something More with Chris Boyd, certified financial planner practitioner and founder of Asset Management Resources, LLC, a registered investment advisor firm. We call it Something More because we like to talk not only about those important dollar and cents issues, but also the quality of life issues that make the money matters matter. Here he is, your fulfillment facilitator, your partner in prosperity, advising clients across the country, your host, J. Christopher Boyd.
Welcome back to Something More with Chris Boyd. I'm Jeff Perry. I'm sitting in with Chris Boyd today. Chris,
I'm here too.
Yeah. Thanks for joining you.
This will be a great topic. Thanks for taking the lead on this, Jeff. Jeff has been coordinating to make arrangements for this. You know, one of the things that we try to do with the show is we try to make it a positive, constructive force that we're dealing with and the issues of the day, certainly for people's personal finance. But, one of the things that is part of our goals is if this is our last show, what do we really want to talk about? What's important? And this is a topic that falls into that category. Jeff brought it up. And so, Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you to see us into this interview.
It certainly does. And as I was talking to Rabbi Jonah Steinberg, I hesitated when we were talking off air because I was about to say we're talking about anti-Semitism. It's the general topic of the day. And I said to him, when this started on October 7th, and then I paused and said, no, this didn't start on October 7th. Israel was attacked by terrorists, Hamas terrorists, on October 7th. But I guess this has just brought it all to light in my world. I know anti-Semitism exists. You see it on the news periodically, with attacks, even in the United States, but it certainly has risen to a level that it has all of our attention and our concern. And I wanted to bring on Rabbi Jonah to talk about it generally or specifically, because I know we're all thinking about it and we're worried about it. And it's surprising to me, I guess I'll put the frame around this. It's surprising to me that we are seeing so much anti-Semitism on our college campuses. We think of our college campuses as being enlightened and generally more left-leaning, meaning more willing to accept all people and not to tolerate these things. I mean, we've lived in a culture of being canceled for any slight comment about any other group, whatever that group label may be. But we find ourselves when we're looking at our most prestigious schools, our universities, Harvard, Penn State, Columbia, being just places where Jewish students cannot be safe. So that's why, Chris, I brought this up, and that's why I'm very thankful that we have Rabbi Jonah Steinberg to join us. Rabbi, you represent the Anti-Defamation League, is that correct?
For New England, yes, I do. I'm the regional director of ADL New England.
Well, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Chris and Jeff. Thank you.
So when I said, I said it last night when we were chatting on the phone, but, starting on October 7th, that was a bit naive of me to say that.
I don't want to say it was naive because something did start on October 7th, and it is a date that will live both in infamy, if I can invoke that famous quotation,
sure,
but it will also live forever in the Jewish psyche. And that is something that has actually been deepening in the consciousness of Israeli community and Jewish community and the community of our allies since October 7th. Just the horror of it, the fact that it is the worst single day in terms of loss of Jewish life that our Jewish community has experienced since the Holocaust, that has been sinking in. The fact that the holiday of Simchat Torah will never be exactly the same in any ensuing year. It will always now include a remembrance of that horrific day. And as that awareness has been sinking in on those of us who are Jewish, on those of us who are connected and care for Israel and our allies, the focus of the world has shifted for some understandable reasons and for some others that we can discuss to now what's Israel doing in Gaza. And that has left a lot of people feeling not well understood, not well supported, and sometimes not without reason afraid. And you mentioned college campuses, Jeff. And it was part of how we came to this conversation. The speed, the alacrity with which students on college campuses decided to side with Hamas, really before Israel had responded at all, even adequately within its own borders. So this was before any action had been taken in Gaza. But you know that we woke up to a statement from 36 Harvard student groups saying we hold Israel solely responsible for all unfolding violence. And that's while the Hamas violence was still ongoing, was still being perpetrated, when there were still terrorists across the border into Israel. You said something else, which is true, that this did not begin on October 7th. And maybe, although I want to get very specifically to this time and what we are seeing in it and what ADL is tracking in it, perhaps I can give a wider framing by saying some people have reached back to the Yom Kippur War of 1973 for a parallel. And I understand why, because failure of anticipation and intelligence and Israel being caught on the back foot. But to me, what this brings up much more than 1973 is 1996. What was 1996? Shimon Peres was the prime minister of Israel. Yitzhak Rabin, who had championed the Oslo Accords and led to the handshake on the White House lawn with Yasser Arafat, which really showed a glimmer of what might be possible. Yitzhak Rabin had been assassinated by a Jewish extremist, opponent of peace. Peres was about 20% up in the polls in Israel coming into an election. And so it seemed pretty certain that the Oslo process would go forward. And then buses started blowing up. And it was Hamas that, and I don't just say that as an accusation, they took responsibility. I can even be more specific, that it was a man by the name of Hassan Salameh of the militant wing of the Hamas organization, the Zadin al-Qassam, who came out and said that he was the mastermind of these bus bombings, and that he had done what he had done to make Israelis realize there never would be peace. As it happens, I lost two dear friends in those bus bombings that killed about 46 people in total. So just thinking proportionally vis-a-vis what's happening today. But this has brought that up for me for two reasons. One, this is not the first time we have seen Hamas do this. And by do this, I mean when there is a glimmer of a hope of peace. Back then it was the Oslo process. Now it was the possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia and the wider Arab world. Hamas throws this elbow, so to speak. And what an elbow. I mean, the most horrific, barbaric families mowed down, kids murdered, and just unspeakable atrocities. And to see the image of that, for example, the paraglider that everyone probably has in mind, the way in which at least one, maybe some of the terrorists got across the border, to see that become a T-shirt emblem, right? To see that become with the slogan "Freedom Fighter"
in the United States,
on college campuses, and to hear college students chanting "Globalize the Intifada," where Intifada means armed opposition to the existence of Israel in the way that Hamas has just demonstrated to us. And to see students on college campuses side with Hamas so speedily really brings up the question, what is going on? And one can answer in one word, anti-Semitism, and it is. There's also a thing of what I would call, and I think what the young people would call, virtue signaling. It is very easy to disown one's own privilege of being at an Ivy League university and maybe some of the guilt that comes along with that by donning a keffiyeh scarf and saying simplistic slogans like "I stand with the freedom fighters of the Palestinian people against Israeli apartheid," without, in most instances, without knowing what on earth one's really talking about. By which I mean without having studied the situation very closely, but being so certain one knows which side to take. And that's been shocking.
It does seem that this movement of BDS has been growing in college campuses for years. You know, that there's this perspective that there's an imbalance of power. And I think sometimes people may not always understand that it's hard for in this scenario for Israel to have a partner in peace when there isn't a partner in peace. You know what I mean? How do you have peace when someone wants to have you exterminated or to have you eliminated as a people? When it comes to this BDS on the college campuses, this need for a two-state solution seems like it's been a long time in the mind of the these kinds of concerns, right? And the challenge for the Palestinian people. But the trouble is the leadership is essentially a terrorist organization that is
in Gaza. Gaza, it has been. That's right.
And not willing to recognize the existence of the legitimacy of the existence of the state of Israel. Essentially, is that not at the core of how and has there not been an opportunity for a two-state solution in the 90s?
In the 90s, there certainly was. I want to make an important distinction, Chris, that you have made, and I just want to lift up. We are not at war with the Palestinian people, right? Hamas is the enemy in this instance and has to be the enemy. And I know it's hard for young people to think about evil and to think about enemy as categories, but Hamas has self-declared as an enemy. To say that one can't partner with leadership like Hamas is correct, as you say, Chris, and it is the world's greatest understatement, because they, even in the midst of all this, have said they'd like to do it again, it being October 7th. They have said that. Right. And in fact, they've said they'd like to do it again and again and again. You cannot make peace with such a leadership. You also can't just live next to it, as we've just seen, because eventually this happens. But I want to make a distinction, and this goes to some of the demonstrations we've been seeing on college campuses. There is nothing wrong, and I say this as a rabbi and I say this as a regional director of ADL, there is nothing wrong with caring for the dignity and the human rights and the worthy aspirations to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Many Israelis care about that. Many Israelis, at their own peril, have voted in elections again and again for Israeli politicians who have tried to work toward a two-state solution. So that is very different than making the paraglider a T-shirt emblem, than holding Israel solely responsible. Although I'm sure even some young Jewish people wish it could be all our fault. Because if it was all our fault, we could wake up the next moment and solve it just by mending our ways. Right. But there is a whole other side to this. But that's not every Palestinian. I don't even believe it's most Palestinians. And the tragedy of this is the way in which the Palestinian people are being so ill-served by people who purport to represent them, such as Hamas. There's a different leadership in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, and there are different issues there. And perhaps more of a potential for partner in peace. But one of the things that the Prime Minister of Israel has said, Netanyahu, and he has politically succeeded in not just fear-mongering, but saying to Israel, do we want what he calls in Hebrew Hamastan Bet, meaning the second Hamas territory on the West Bank. Now, that's not the only possible outcome of a Palestinian state on the West Bank, but it is a possibility that for the reasons we've just seen, scares the heck reasonably out of Israelis. We have to arrive at two states for two peoples. I think the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, have been exactly right and by the way, we've seen the President reiterate his support for Israel just yesterday in meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu. There needs to be a solution that in which this cannot happen again.
But Rabbi, there's really, so this is my opinion, I appreciate your comments on it. There really can't be a second state if it's controlled by a terrorist organization being influenced by Iran.
That's right, and we have to be quite sure that that cannot happen. That's exactly what you're saying. I come back to come back to campus for a moment, just
Yes.
yesterday, ADL released a study of anti-Semitism on campus since October 7th. And as someone who worked on campus for 12 years, I directed Hillel at Harvard University and was a Jewish chaplain at Harvard for the 12 years prior to coming to ADL. There were a few statistics in that study that really jumped out to me, and I want to name two of them. One is that before October 7th, by and large, and quite distinctly, most Jewish students on college campuses reported that they were entirely comfortable speaking of being Jewish, just being forthright in their own Jewish identities. Post October 7th, that number has fallen to 39%. That means under 40% of Jewish respondents on college campuses in the United States today say that they are comfortable disclosing to their peers the mere fact of their being Jewish. That is terribly, terribly concerning. The other statistic that really strikes me is that most college students say, yes, we were required to take part in some diversity, equity, and inclusion training as part of orientation, as part of our becoming part of the college community.
Okay.
But only 18% of respondents report that anti-Semitism had figured in any way in the diversity, equity, and inclusion training they got on the way into college community. And so, as anti-Semitism, and it is anti-Semitism, is a problem on college campuses, we have to also take stock of the fact that campuses have done way too little way before October 7th to address that in any way.
Rabbi, I also looked at that study that was released, and the statistic that jumped out at me, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, was 73% of Jewish students have experienced some type of hate directed towards them on a college
That's right,
campus.
and 44% of non-Jewish students say they've seen it, they've observed it. So one doesn't have, and I want to say there that anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is a societal problem. It affects all of us, whatever our religion and background. This is a societal sickness.
So why are these universities, who certainly have the knowledge and the resources and the information, not responding to this even before, as you mentioned about the orientations, but why are they not stepping up, and this is obviously an opinion, but doing the right thing when we're in the crisis here?
Yeah, well, an interesting thing about, to give a bit of background before I come to the crisis moment, an interesting thing about anti-Semitism, Jeff, is it's not just a negative prejudice, in other words, thinking of Jews as less than. Sometimes anti-Semitism manifests by thinking of Jews as more than. And so there's been a phenomenon of thinking of Jewish people as successful, as empowered, as moneyed, as influential. These are caricatures. Yes, there are successful Jews. There are also a lot of Jews who live below the poverty line. And one doesn't have to go far, even where I sit in our Boston community, to see that is true. But there is a caricature of the rich, powerful, influential Jew. And because some buildings on campuses are named for wealthy Jewish benefactors, it's easy to make those caricatures, and therefore easy to say Jewish community is not a community that deserves any attention in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the best case, it's a fully accomplished success story, and so why should we concern ourselves with the welfare of Jewish people? And in the worst case, maybe some people think it's a suspicious concentration of power that is somehow nefarious, and therefore it somehow doesn't compute that the Jewish minority, and it is a small minority on college campuses, should deserve the attention of DEI departments. I think October 7th and the aftermath has shown us clearly, very, very clearly, the error of that way of thinking. And so one of the things that has to happen is that anti-Semitism awareness has to become part of the DEI world on college campuses.
Yeah, good point.
Stat.
Would you just a couple of things? You commented on this essentially, but in a passing way, I'd love you to elaborate. That there is a distinction in rhetoric that people might have if they're in favor of Palestinian human rights, that's not the same thing as being anti-Semitic. right? If that there may
and I've said it is not the same thing.
not the same thing. But let's talk about then what are those drivers that are underpinning this? You've kind of talked about a little bit about that. What are the solutions? How do we
Well, first of all, let me say I mentioned two dates: 1973, the Yom Kippur War; 1996, the election that first gave us Prime Minister Netanyahu when the Oslo Accords were at stake. And part of what happened there that I didn't mention is in the Israeli reprisals for those bus bombings, those caused the Arab citizenry of Israel, 20% of the population, to boycott those elections. That's 20% of the Israeli electorate. That's how Shimon Peres fell and Bibi Netanyahu rose, to oversimplify, but that is part of the story.
So essentially involvement, that's part of it.
But the point, in answer to your question, Chris, is that those two dates, 1973, 1996, if you ask the average college, I would make a bet, and this is an asset management show, so I would say I would stake some money on, if you ask the average protester at these pro-Palestinian demonstrations that sometimes become anti-Semitic, what was happening in Israel in 1973, what was happening in Israel in 1996,
they'd have no idea.
They'd have no idea. No idea. So part of what we're seeing is a tragic shallowness of knowledge at universities, where we ought to be seeing, oh, something really seismic is happening. Let's study this responsibly. Let's look at it. And yes, there are questions to be asked about it, and there's a complex history to be engaged. And I'm not saying that that there are not problems to be talked about in Israeli politics and society. Israel is a divided country politically, much as the United States is. But just as we didn't see people lining up outside the State Department during the previous presidential administration to renounce their their American citizenship because they were unpleased with the leadership of this country, we should not expect Israelis to renounce their country when the camp of peace is underrepresented, to say the least, in government. So yes, there has to be eventually a solution. I pray for that. I'm a rabbi. Many of us pray for that. We also devoutly work for it. And as you've said, you cannot work toward peace with a partner who is committed to your destruction. That is not the whole of the Palestinian people, but that is Hamas.
For the issues on the college campuses, do you think it's a productive move for the U.S. Justice Department, Department of Education, to open this Title VI investigation against these, specifically Harvard University? Is that a proper way to handle this?
It's difficult to comment. I don't mean to be evasive, but it's difficult to comment because the Department of Education has not yet disclosed precisely what it's looking into on the Harvard campus. And I do want to note that Claudine Gay, the president, since her initial statement, which I think made the error of trying to seek balance in a way that came across as was perceived as some kind of drawing moral equivalency. She has improved the message substantially. She's also done several of the things that ADL has been recommending, which is to say she's established a committee to study anti-Semitism study and do something about anti-Semitism on campus. And she made the announcement of that at Harvard Hillel, at the Jewish Center on campus, at Shabbat dinner, which she attended. So we're beginning, and she's not alone in that. And the champion of this, of course, has been President Ron Leibowitz at Brandeis University, who has just come out so unequivocally in saying that campus, not just because of its Jewish heritage as Brandeis University, but on the point of moral and intellectual leadership, will not brook on its campus support for terrorism. We are seeing that more and more. And so I don't want to demonize the campus world entirely, as administrators in good faith struggle with what they now realize is a big problem on their campuses. I think it is appropriate that the Department of Education is looking into this to see if there are violations of the Civil Rights Act's Title VI, which is meant to protect people of ethnic and national identity on campus. Because once one is admitted to college in the United States, and these colleges are such wonderful kaleidoscopes of American society and of global society, if one is not able to be confident and forthright in being who one is and in representing oneself truthfully on a college campus, if one has to live in fear, then the project of learning is falling down.
Well, we're certainly seeing other tactics taken by some large donors. Specifically, I'm looking at Penn State, where there are significant donors who are stepping away and asking for the president of Penn State to resign. So there's pressures coming from different ways.
And you've seen that at Harvard as well, with the withdrawal of the Wexner Fellowship program from the Harvard Kennedy School, and other donors of name who've put their money where their mouths are, so to speak, in
Right.
saying that they cannot back.
It's their free speech as well.
Free speech is an important value, by the way. So is academic freedom and freedom of academic inquiry. These are important values, and our universities are right to care for them, and in some ways to champion them. But there is a difference, just as there is a difference between caring for the rights and the hopes of self-determination of the Palestinian people on the one side, and calling for the extermination of Israel on the other side. Right? There is a difference between invoking freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry on the one hand as laudable as values that I think America can cherish and be proud of, and saying that gives carte blanche, that gives full permission for professors to alienate their Jewish students, and not to mention their Israeli students in classrooms, and to create an atmosphere of learning in which the fact is that not all are welcome.
Your point is well taken, but I was speaking of the free speech of the donors.
Oh, it is not. They have a right to do with their funding whatever they choose. And at the same time, I hope that Jewish community does not just flee from these colleges, not in the student bodies and not in the engagement with leadership, because these are very important places for Jewish community to be engaged. And so I understand when some Jewish students in a moment like this feel like they would like to get the hell out and find their way to some different place.
It's a natural response, yeah.
It is and yet it is so important that Jewish communities are where they are on these college campuses. And they, just like every other community of diversity in college, and we would not see this same scope lock and demonization tolerated, I think, with regard to other ethnic, national, religious minorities on campuses. It's vitally important for American universities to include proud and forthright Jewish community.
Well,
thank you, Rabbi.
It's an important discussion as well. Thank you, Rabbi Jonah Steinberg from the Anti-Defamation League, for being with us. And we hope we see improvements in the tone and the rhetoric and the hearts of people in our midst. So thank you so much.
Amen to that, Chris. And thanks, Chris, and to you, Jeff, as well, very much.
Thank you.
For having me with you.
Thank you. Hope to have you on again sometime.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Something More with Chris Boyd. Call us for help, whether it's financial planning, portfolio management, insurance concerns, or those quality of life issues that make the money matters matter. Whatever's on your mind, visit us at amrfinancial.com or call us toll-free at 866-771-8901 or send us your questions to radio@amrfinancial.com.
You're listening to Something More with Chris Boyd, Financial Talk Show.
Asset Management Resources, LLC, and J. Christopher Boyd, CFP, provide investment advice on an individual basis to clients only. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. The information given on this program is in the nature of general financial comments and cannot be relied upon as pertaining to your specific situation. AMR, LLC cannot guarantee that using the information from this show will generate profits or ensure freedom from loss. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions.